Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on battlefields. They're fought in courtrooms by ordinary people with everything to lose. Gideon was just a single father trying to make ends meet, working long hours and scraping by, when a wealthy woman accused him of something unthinkable. She stood before the judge, her voice filled with contempt, claiming he had hurt her child. Her expensive lawyers painted him as dangerous. The courtroom whispered their judgment. Gideon sat quietly, his worn hands folded, knowing his simple words carried no weight against her money and power. But then something unexpected happened. The woman's own daughter stood up, small but brave, ready to speak the truth. What could she possibly say to change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun barely crept through the thin curtains of Gideon's one-bedroom apartment when his alarm clock rattled to life at 5:30. He reached over to silence it, his calloused hand moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who had long ago accepted that rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. The apartment was small, just a living room that doubled as his bedroom, a kitchenette with aging appliances, and a bathroom where the faucet dripped no matter how many times he tried to fix it. But it was clean. That mattered to Gideon. He rose from the pull-out sofa, folded the bedding with military precision, and transformed the space back into something resembling a living room. On the small table by the window sat a hand-carved wooden toy, a horse with a flowing mane, sanded smooth and painted with care. He had made it last week for the Rodriguez boy down the hall, whose birthday was coming up. The child's mother worked 2 jobs, just like Gideon, and he knew there wouldn't be money for much of a celebration. Gideon moved through his morning routine with quiet purpose. Coffee brewed in the old percolator his late wife, Anne, had bought at a yard sale 15 years ago. He still remembered her laugh when she'd brought it home, declaring it vintage when he'd called it ancient. 3 years had passed since the cancer took her, but the apartment still held her presence in small ways. The herb garden she'd started on the windowsill that he kept alive. The framed photos on the bookshelf. The way he still made coffee strong enough to wake the dead. Just how she liked it. By 6:15, Gideon was out the door, his work boots heavy on the stairs as he descended to the street. The neighborhood was already stirring. Mrs. Russo, the elderly widow in 2B, was putting out seed for the pigeons. She waved, and he tipped his head respectfully. "Morning, Mrs. Russo. Did that leak under your sink get any worse?" "You fixed it perfect, dear. Haven't had a drop since." Her weathered face creased with a smile. "You're too good to us, Gideon. Just being neighborly, ma'am." The construction site where Gideon worked was 40 minutes away by bus. He was a Finnish carpenter, detail work that required steady hands and patience. The foreman, a gruff man named Pete Sutherland, appreciated Gideon's craftsmanship and reliability. In an industry where workers called in sick with hangovers or simply didn't show up, Gideon's consistent presence meant something. "Gideon, need you on the crown molding in the master suite," Pete called out when he arrived. "Client's particular about the corners. I'll take care of it." The work was meditative, measuring, cutting, fitting each piece with precision. Gideon lost himself in it, in the smell of fresh-cut wood and the satisfaction of joints that met perfectly. His father had been a carpenter too, had taught him that honest work done well was its own reward. "Don't cut corners, son," the old man used to say. "Your work is your word made solid." By 3:30, Gideon was clocking out, grabbing a quick sandwich from a food truck, and heading across town to the Riverside Community Center. He'd been volunteering there for 2 years, ever since Anne passed, and he'd needed somewhere to channel the emptiness. The center served the neighborhood's working families, offering after-school programs, homework help, and a safe place for kids whose parents worked late. "Gideon!" A chorus of young voices greeted him as he entered. Children swarmed around him, some wanting to show him drawings, others eager to continue the story he'd been reading them all week. All right, let me get through the door first," he said, his weathered face breaking into a genuine smile. This was what filled the hollow places Anne's death had left behind. These children, with their boundless energy and unguarded hearts, reminded him why kindness mattered. Among the children was Sophie Langford, a quiet 8-year-old with serious eyes and blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. She hung back from the crowd as she always did, watching rather than participating. Gideon had noticed her over the past few months, how she arrived in expensive clothes that seemed too formal for a community centre, how her nanny dropped her off with barely a word, how Sophie seemed to carry a sadness that no child should know. "Hello, Sophie," Gideon said gently when the other children had dispersed to various activities. "Would you like to help me set up the art supplies?" She nodded, following him to the storage closet where paints and paper were kept. As they worked together in comfortable silence, Gideon noticed the careful way she moved, the way she flinched slightly when he reached past her for a box of crayons. "Everything all right at home, Sophie?" "Yes, sir." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "You know you can talk to me if something's bothering you." "Or to Miss Patricia." He nodded toward the center's director, a warm woman with graying hair who had a gift for drawing out troubled children. Sophie simply nodded again, but something in her eyes suggested she wanted to say more. Before Gideon could encourage her, the moment passed, and she hurried off to join the other children. The afternoon unfolded in its usual rhythm, helping with homework, mediating disputes over toys, reading stories to the younger ones. Gideon had a gift for it, a patience that came from genuine care. He remembered each child's name, their siblings, their struggles with math or reading. He celebrated their small victories and comforted their disappointments. At 6 o'clock, parents began arriving, tired from their own long days but grateful for the center's care. Gideon greeted each one, sometimes in English, sometimes in Spanish. Occasionally in the broken Tagalog he'd picked up from the Filipino families in his building. Sophie's nanny arrived promptly at 6:15, as she always did. The woman, middle-aged, with kind eyes that seemed perpetually worried, barely acknowledged Gideon as she collected Sophie. But Sophie turned back at the door, giving him a small wave that felt somehow significant. After the centre closed at 7, Gideon caught another bus to the office building downtown, where he worked as a night janitor. The job was mindless, but necessary. His construction pay barely covered rent and food. The janitorial work paid for everything else. He mopped floors, emptied trash, cleaned bathrooms in the silent building, his mind wandering to the day's moments. The children's laughter, Sophie's sad eyes, Mrs. Rousseau's gratitude for a fixed pipe. He thought, as he often did, about Anne, how she would have loved seeing him at the community centre, surrounded by children. They'd wanted kids of their own, but it hadn't happened. And then her diagnosis came, and suddenly time became a luxury they didn't have. "You got so much love to give, Gideon," she told him near the end. "Don't let it die with me. Find somewhere to put it." The community centre was where he'd put it. At 11:30, Gideon finally headed home, his body aching with honest fatigue. The night bus was nearly empty, just him and a few other souls, whose lives demanded they work when others slept. He leaned his head against the window, watching the city slide past in pools of streetlight and shadow. Back in his apartment, Gideon microwaved leftover rice and beans, ate standing at the counter, and fell into bed without bothering to pull out the sofa. Sleep came quickly, dreamless and deep. He didn't know, as he drifted off, that his simple life was about to shatter, that a child's bruise and a wealthy woman's panic would transform him from a good man into an accused monster, that everything he'd built, his reputation, his peace, his purpose, would soon hang by the thread of truth in a system that often favored power over justice. But that reckoning was still days away. For now Gideon slept, his worn work boots by the door, ready for another day of honest labor. It was a Thursday afternoon when everything changed. Gideon arrived at the community centre at his usual time, greeting the children who rushed to meet him. The autumn air had turned crisp, and the kids were energized by the cooling weather, their voices echoing off the centre's walls with particular enthusiasm. Sophie arrived later than usual, slipping in quietly, while the other children were engrossed in a game of tag in the gymnasium. Gideon was in the art room, helping a group of younger children with a painting project, when he noticed her standing in the doorway. Something about her posture, more withdrawn than usual, caught his attention. "Sophie, would you like to paint with us?" She shook her head, then hesitated. "Mr. Gideon, can I talk to you?" "Of course." He wiped his hands on a rag and moved to where she stood, careful to keep the interaction visible through the open door, something the center's policies required, and he scrupulously followed. "What's on your mind?" Sophie glanced around nervously, then slowly pulled up the sleeve of her cardigan. A dark bruise circled her upper arm, the kind that came from a firm grip. Gideon's heart clenched with concern. "Sophie, how did this happen?" His voice was gentle, free of accusation, but worry threaded through every word. She began, her voice trembling. "My stepfather, he was upset about something at work, and The door to the center burst open with a force that made several children jump. Beatrice Langford swept in, her designer heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. She was tall, impeccably dressed, with dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Everything about her screamed wealth and control, from her tailored suit to the diamond studs in her ears that probably cost more than Gideon made in 6 months. "Sophie." Her voice carried across the room like a whip crack. "Come here now." The little girl's face went pale. She quickly yanked her sleeve down, but not before Beatrice's sharp eyes caught the movement. The woman's gaze swung to Gideon, and something cold flickered across her expression. "What's going on here?" Beatrice demanded, closing the distance between them with purposeful strides. "Mrs. Langford," Gideon said calmly, standing up. "Sophie just arrived." "Sophie, what happened to your arm?" Beatrice cut him off, grabbing her daughter's wrist and pulling up the sleeve roughly. When she saw the bruise, her face transformed, shock giving way to something calculating, dangerous. "I was just telling Mr. Gideon—" Sophie started. "Be quiet," Beatrice snapped. Then to Gideon, her voice took on a tone of barely controlled fury. "Did you do this to my daughter?" The question hung in the air like poison. Around them, the room had fallen silent. Other children stopped what they were doing. Patricia Warren, the center director, appeared from her office, sensing the tension. "Mrs. Langford, I can assure you—" Patricia began. "I want to know if this man put his hands on my child." Beatrice's voice rose, shrill with accusation. Gideon felt ice flood his veins. "Ma'am, I did not. Sophie was showing me her arm and trying to tell me, 'Mommy, please, he didn't—'" Sophie's voice broke. "I said, be quiet." Beatrice yanked Sophie behind her protectively, as if shielding her from a predator. "Patricia, I want to see whatever security footage you have. I want to know exactly what happened here, and I want to know now." Patricia's professional composure held firm, though Gideon could see the worry in her eyes. "We do have cameras in the common areas. Let's all take a breath and review what happened. I'm certain there's been a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Beatrice's laugh was sharp and bitter. "My daughter has bruises, and she was alone with this man." "That's not a misunderstanding, that's assault." The word landed like a physical blow. Gideon felt his world tilt. Around them, parents who had arrived for pickup were staring. Children looked confused and frightened. Everything he'd built here, the trust, the relationships, the safe space he'd helped create, was crumbling in real time. "Mrs. Langford," Gideon said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I understand you're upset, but Sophie was trying to tell me something about how she got that bruise. If you'll just let her speak, I will not let you manipulate my daughter further." Beatrice pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. Patricia, I'll be filing a formal complaint with the center's board. And you," she pointed at Gideon with a manicured finger, "you stay away from Sophie. Stay away from all these children." Sophie was crying now, quiet tears streaming down her face. She tried once more. "Mommy, it wasn't—" Not another word. Beatrice's grip on her daughter's shoulder was tight enough to leave marks. "We're leaving. The police will meet us at the hospital." As Beatrice dragged Sophie toward the exit, the little girl looked back at Gideon. In her eyes he saw apology, fear, and something else, a desperate need to speak truth that was being silenced. Then they were gone, the door slamming behind them with finality. The room remained frozen in the aftermath. Patricia moved to Gideon's side, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of support. "Gideon, you need to tell me exactly what happened." He did, his voice hollow with shock. Explained how Sophie had approached him, shown him the bruise, started to tell him about her stepfather before Beatrice arrived. Patricia nodded, already pulling out her own phone to call the center's lawyer. "The cameras will show everything," she assured him. "You followed every protocol. You weren't alone with her. The door was open. There were witnesses." But Gideon barely heard her. He was thinking about Sophie's frightened face, about Beatrice's cold calculation, about the word assault echoing in his mind. He'd worked with children his entire time at the center, had undergone background checks, had never once crossed a line. And now, in the space of 5 minutes, he'd become suspect. The other parents were gathering their children quickly, casting uncertain glances his way. He could see the doubt taking root, the way people stepped back, the way they held their children a little closer. It didn't matter that he'd done nothing wrong. The accusation itself was contamination. Patricia sent him home early, said it was standard procedure until things were sorted out. Gideon walked to the bus stop in a daze, his hands trembling. He thought of Anne, of what she would say. She'd always believed in truth, in justice, in the fundamental goodness of people. But Anne had never faced anything like this. At home, Gideon sat on his sofa bed and stared at the wooden horse he'd carved for the Rodriguez boy. His hands, these hands that built and fixed and helped, were suddenly weapons in someone else's story. He had no idea that this was just the beginning, that Beatrice Langford's panic and pride would set in motion a legal nightmare that would test everything he believed about justice and truth. That night, Gideon didn't sleep. He lay awake, replaying those terrible minutes, wondering how he could have done anything differently. And he thought about Sophie, forced into silence, and wondered if the truth would ever have a chance to be heard. The police arrived at Gideon's apartment 2 days later on a Saturday morning. He'd been expecting them. Patricia had warned him that. Beatrice had filed a formal complaint, but the reality of 2 officers standing in his doorway still sent his heart hammering against his ribs. "Gideon Walsh?" the older officer asked, his face professionally neutral. "Yes, sir. We need you to come down to the station to answer some questions regarding an allegation of child abuse." The words hung in the narrow hallway. Mrs. Rousseau's door cracked open across the way, her worried face peering out. Mr. Delgado from downstairs stood frozen on the stairwell, grocery bags in hand. Gideon saw their expressions shift, confusion, concern, and something worse. Doubt. "I'll cooperate fully," Gideon said quietly. "Let me get my jacket." The police station was a blur of fluorescent lights and institutional grey. They questioned him for 3 hours, the same questions asked different ways, probing for inconsistencies. Gideon told the truth simply and completely. He described Sophie, showing him her bruise, her attempt to explain before her mother interrupted, Beatrice's immediate accusation. They took his statement, informed him that charges were being considered, and finally released him with instructions not to go near Sophie or the Langford residence. Walking home, Gideon felt hollowed out. The city looked the same, but everything had changed. He was no longer just a man going about his business. He was a suspect, someone people might cross the street to avoid. On Monday, he received a call from his construction foreman. "Gideon, it's Pete. Listen, the company got word about the police investigation." Pete's voice was uncomfortable, apologetic. "Corporate policy says we gotta put you on unpaid leave until it's resolved." "I'm sorry, man. I know you. I don't believe it for a second, but my hands are tied." "I understand." Gideon's voice was steady, though his stomach dropped. Without that paycheck, he'd burned through his meager savings in weeks. "For what it's worth, I hope you clear this up quick. You're one of the best carpenters I've got." The community center called next. Patricia's voice was thick with regret. "The board met last night. Until the investigation concludes, they've asked that you not volunteer here." "I fought them on it, Gideon. I told them what the cameras showed, that you did nothing wrong. But they're worried about liability." "I understand," he said again, because what else could he say? On Wednesday, a courier delivered legal documents. Beatrice Langford was pursuing formal charges. The paperwork detailed allegations of physical abuse, inappropriate contact, and emotional manipulation. Reading the accusations, seeing his actions twisted into something sinister, made Gideon physically ill. He was assigned a public defender, a man named Donald Pierce, who met him at a coffee shop near the courthouse. Pierce was in his 50s, with tired eyes and a briefcase held together with duct tape. He ordered black coffee and got straight to business. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Walsh. Mrs. Langford has retained Sterling Vaughan. He's one of the most expensive defense attorneys in the city, except he's prosecuting you as a private action through the DA's office. She's got resources, connections, and apparently a strong desire to see you convicted. I didn't hurt that child." Gideon's hands wrapped around his own coffee cup like it was an anchor. "She was trying to tell me her stepfather caused the bruise. When her mother showed up," Pierce made notes on a yellow legal pad. "The community center's surveillance footage will help. It shows your interaction was brief, visible to others, and that you followed proper protocols. But here's the problem. The footage doesn't show what happened before Sophie approached you. Vaughan will argue you could have hurt her earlier, that she was coming to you out of fear or confusion. That's not what happened. I believe you. But belief and proof are different things in court." Pierce leaned back, studying Gideon. "Tell me about your background. Any prior complaints, allegations, anything Vaughan might dig up?" "Nothing. I volunteered at the center for 2 years. Before that, I coached Little League for a season. Background checks, references, everything was clean. Good, we'll need character witnesses. People who can testify to your integrity, your interactions with children." Pierce tapped his pen against the pad. "I'll be straight with you. Our resources are limited compared to what Vaughan will bring. He'll have expert witnesses, private investigators, the works. We need to be smart and strategic." Over the following days, Gideon's world continued to contract. At the grocery store, the cashier who usually chatted with him avoided eye contact. Parents he recognized from the community center crossed the street when they saw him coming. A mother he'd helped last year, her son struggling with reading until Gideon spent weeks patiently tutoring him, now clutched her child's hand and hurried past without acknowledgement. Only Mrs. Russo remained steadfast. She knocked on his door that Thursday evening with a covered dish. "You need to eat," she said firmly, pushing past him into the apartment. "And don't give me any argument." Gideon accepted the food, homemade lasagna that smelled like comfort, and felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. "Mrs. Russo, you don't have to—" "Hush. I've known you 3 years. Gideon Walsh. I've watched you help every person in this building who needed it. You fixed my sink. You carried Mr. Chen's groceries up 4 flights when his back went out. You shoveled the front walk all last winter without being asked." She settled into his one good chair with the authority of a woman who'd lived through enough to know truth when she saw it. "That woman is lying, and I'll tell anyone who asks. It might hurt you, being associated with me right now. Then let it hurt. I'm 83 years old. What are they going to do to me?" She waved a dismissive hand. "Now eat that before it gets cold. And tell me what your lawyer said." Gideon ate and talked, and for the first time since Beatrice's accusation, felt less alone. Mrs. Russo listened with the patient attention of someone who understood that listening was sometimes the greatest gift you could give. "Truth has a way of surfacing," she said when he finished. "It might take time, but it comes out. You just have to hold on until it does." That night, Gideon lay on his sofa bed and thought about faith, the kind Anne used to talk about, the kind that believed in goodness even when evidence suggested otherwise. He'd lost much of that faith when she died, had rebuilt it slowly through work and service and small kindnesses. Now it was being tested again, in a different way. He thought about Sophie, forced into silence by her mother's fear and pride. He wondered if she was okay, if anyone had listened to what she'd tried to say. And he prayed, something he hadn't done much since Anne's death, that somehow, some way, the truth would find its way into the light. Donald Pierce called Gideon on a Tuesday morning with a strategy that felt both hopeful and desperate. We need character witnesses, Pierce said without preamble. People who can testify to your integrity, your history with children, your reputation in the community. Vaughn's going to paint you as a predator who fooled everyone. We need to show the jury who you really are. Gideon sat at his small kitchen table, the phone pressed to his ear, and felt a wave of reluctance wash over him. I don't want to drag people into this. They have their own lives, their own reputations to protect. I understand that impulse, Pierce said, his voice patient but firm. But this is your life we're talking about. If convicted, you're looking at years in prison. You need people to stand up for you. So Gideon began the humbling task of asking for help. He started with Mrs. Russo, who was already waiting with a handwritten letter when he knocked on her door that afternoon. Wrote it last night, she said, pressing the envelope into his hands. 3 pages about what kind of man you are. If they want me to testify, I'll tell that judge exactly what I think of this nonsense. Mr. Delgado, who owned the bodega on the corner, was next. Gideon found him restocking shelves and hesitated in the doorway, suddenly uncertain. The shopkeeper looked up and, reading Gideon's expression, set down his inventory clipboard. You need something from me, Mr. Delgado stated rather than asked. My lawyer suggested character references. Gideon's voice was quiet. But I understand if you'd rather not get involved. Mr. Delgado studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 5 years ago, my register came up short 3 times in 1 week. I was going crazy, trying to figure out who was stealing from me. You remember what you did? Gideon shook his head. You came in here, bought a coffee, and told me you'd noticed the teenage kid I'd hired, my nephew, had a gambling problem. You'd seen him at the convenience store buying scratch tickets every day with crisp 20s. Mr. Delgado's eyes held steady on Gideon's. You could have minded your own business. Instead, you helped me help my nephew. That boy's in college now, hasn't gambled in 4 years. That was who you are. Mr. Delgado pulled out a notepad. I'll write your letter, and I'll testify if they need me to. Word spread through the neighborhood in the way things do in close-knit communities. By week's end, Pierce had a stack of letters. Mrs. Rodriguez wrote about how Gideon had carved toys for her children every Christmas. The elderly Mr. Abbott detailed how Gideon had spent 3 weekends fixing his wheelchair ramp for free. A single mother named Jennifer Kowalski described how Gideon had tutored her son in math for 6 months, turning a failing student into one who now loved numbers. Each letter felt like both a gift and a weight. These people were taking risks for him, potentially marking themselves as supporters of an accused child abuser. Yet they did it anyway, because they knew him, really knew him, and refused to let accusations rewrite history. Pierce was pleased with the letters, but realistic about their limitations. These will help establish your character, but Vaughn's going to argue that predators are often charming, that they hide in plain sight by being helpful and trustworthy. We need something more concrete. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. Pierce worked to obtain the community center's surveillance footage, medical records, and any other evidence that might support Gideon's account. Meanwhile, Beatrice Langford's legal machine was building its case with ruthless efficiency. A private investigator began following Gideon. He noticed the same car parked across from his building at odd hours, saw a man with a camera at the grocery store. Every aspect of his life was being documented, scrutinized for anything that could be twisted into evidence of guilt. The financial pressure was mounting. Without his construction income, Gideon was burning through savings meant for emergencies. The janitorial job barely covered rent and food. He'd already skipped 2 meals that week to stretch his budget. Pride kept him from accepting the money Mrs. Russo tried to press into his hands. Though he was grateful for the meals she continued to bring. One evening, as Gideon walked home from the bus stop, he passed the community center. Through the windows, he could see children playing, volunteers helping with homework. He'd spent so many hours in those rooms, had built so many relationships with those kids. Now he wasn't allowed within 100 yards of the place, a figure separated from the building's shadow. Patricia Warren, the center director. She glanced around nervously before approaching him. "I'm not supposed to talk to you," she said quietly. "But you should know, Sophie hasn't been back since that day. Beatrice withdrew her from our program." Gideon's heart clenched. "Is she all right?" "I don't know. I tried calling to check on her, but Beatrice won't take my calls." Patricia's face was troubled. "Gideon, I've watched the footage probably 50 times. You did everything right. You were visible, appropriate, concerned. That little girl was trying to tell you something and her mother shut her down. Can you testify to that?" "My lawyer says I can describe what I saw, but I can't speculate about what Sophie intended to say." Patricia's frustration was evident. "The whole thing feels wrong. That child needs help, and instead her mother is using her as a weapon against you." They stood in the autumn darkness, and two people bound by helplessness and concern for a little girl neither could reach. "Keep fighting," Patricia said finally. "The truth matters, even when it takes time to surface." The preliminary hearing arrived with the cold clarity of an autumn morning. The courtroom was smaller than Gideon had imagined, wood-paneled and formal. Beatrice sat with Sterling Vaughan, a silver-haired man in an impeccable suit who radiated expensive competence. She wore black, her face composed in an expression of dignified suffering. Pierce presented the surveillance footage, which showed exactly what Gideon had described, a brief, visible interaction where Sophie approached him and displayed her arm. The footage couldn't capture their conversation, but it clearly showed Beatrice's dramatic entrance and accusation. Vaughan was dismissive. "This footage shows only seconds of interaction. It doesn't show what happened before, what might have been said, what understanding might have been established between the defendant and the child." The judge reviewed the evidence and ruled there was sufficient cause for trial. A court date was set for 6 weeks out. As Gideon left the courthouse with Pierce, he felt the weight of what lay ahead. "We've got work to do," Pierce said, already mentally preparing for trial. "But we're not without ammunition. Those letters, the footage, your clean record, it all matters." That night, Gideon sat alone in his apartment, holding the wooden horse he'd carved weeks ago. It was supposed to be a birthday gift for a child who'd never receive it now. He thought about Sophie wherever she was, and hoped she was safe. He thought about justice, and whether it would be enough to simply tell the truth. Mrs. Rousseau's words echoed in his mind. Truth has a way of surfacing. He had to believe that. It was all he had left to hold on to. The trial began on a Monday morning in late October. Frost had touched the city overnight, leaving the courthouse steps slick and treacherous. Gideon arrived early with Donald Pierce, his only decent suit pressed and his hands steady despite the fear coursing through him. Mrs. Rousseau had insisted on coming, sitting in the gallery with her purse clutched in her lap like armor. Jury selection took the entire first day. Gideon watched as Sterling Vaughan systematically excluded anyone who looked like they might understand struggle. The construction worker who reminded Gideon of his crew, the grocery clerk who probably knew what it meant to count pennies, the retired teacher who had kind eyes. What remained was a jury of comfortable people, accountants, managers, a real estate agent, a bank executive, people whose lives had likely never intersected with someone like Gideon. Pierce did his best to challenge the obvious bias, but Vaughan had done this 1,000 times. He knew exactly how to shape a jury, how to stack it with people who would trust wealth and status over a man with calloused hands and worn shoes. On Tuesday morning, opening statements began. Vaughan rose with the confident grace of someone who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is a case about betrayal of trust." Gideon Walsh presented himself as a good man, a helper, someone children could turn to. He volunteered at a community center, surrounded himself with vulnerable young people, and gained the trust of families who had no reason to doubt him. Vaughan's voice was measured, reasonable, devastating. But on the afternoon of September 14th, 8-year-old Sophie Langford discovered the terrible truth behind that kind facade. When she tried to tell someone about the abuse she'd suffered, her abuser was standing right there, controlling the narrative, manipulating the situation, ensuring his victim stayed silent. Gideon felt each word like a physical blow. The jury watched him, their faces carefully neutral, and he wondered what they saw. A predator, or just a tired man who'd tried to help and paid for it. Pierce's opening was simpler, more direct. The prosecution wants you to believe a story supported by fear and assumption rather than facts. The evidence will show that Gideon Walsh is exactly who he appears to be, a widower who found purpose in helping others, who saw a child in distress and responded with appropriate concern. You will see surveillance footage of the incident in question. You will hear from people who've known Mr. Walsh for years, and you will be left wondering why a mother would rather destroy an innocent man than confront the truth her daughter tried to tell. The first witness was Beatrice herself. She took the stand, wearing a navy dress and pearl earrings, her face composed but her eyes carrying just enough moisture to suggest barely contained emotion. Vaughan led her through her testimony with practiced care. Mrs. Langford, you please tell the jury about September 14th. I arrived at the community center to pick up my daughter. Sophie? Beatrice's voice trembled slightly, perfectly calibrated. She wasn't with the other children. I found her in a side room with the defendant. When I approached, I noticed she was pulling down her sleeve as if hiding something. What did you do? I asked to see her arm. That's when I discovered the bruising. Beatrice's hand went to her throat, a gesture of distress. Dark marks, clearly from someone's grip. I asked her what happened and she looked terrified, absolutely terrified. Did she explain how she got the bruises? She tried to speak, but Beatrice gestured toward Gideon. He kept interrupting, talking over her, trying to control what she said. Gideon wanted to shout that it was a lie, that Beatrice had been the one silencing Sophie, but Pierce's hand on his arm kept him still. What made you believe Mr. Walsh was responsible for your daughter's injuries? Sophie had been fine when I dropped her off. No bruises, no marks. She spent 2 hours at that center, much of it unsupervised with him. And when I found them together, she was clearly afraid. Beatrice's voice broke convincingly. As a mother, you know. You just know when your child has been hurt. Vaughan let that sit with the jury before continuing. Has Sophie spoken about what happened? She's been too traumatized. She's seeing a therapist now, but she still can't talk about it without becoming upset. Beatrice dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. That man destroyed my daughter's sense of safety. She used to love going to the community center, and now she has nightmares. When Pierce rose for cross-examination, Gideon could see the uphill battle written in his lawyer's tight shoulders. Mrs. Langford, you said Sophie was terrified when you arrived. But isn't it true that she was trying to speak, trying to explain something when you silenced her? I was trying to protect her from further manipulation. Manipulation? Or was she trying to tell you something you didn't want to hear? Pierce's voice was sharp now. Isn't it true that your husband, Sophie's stepfather, has a temper? Vaughan shot to his feet. Objection. Irrelevant and prejudicial. Your Honor, it's directly relevant to the origin of the child's injuries, Pierce argued. The judge considered. I'll allow it, but tread carefully, Mr. Pierce. Pierce turned back to Beatrice, whose composed mask had cracked slightly. Mrs. Langford, does your husband drink? Occasionally, like most adults. And when he drinks, does his temper worsen? My husband has nothing to do with this case. Beatrice's voice had turned cold, defensive, doesn't he? Your daughter had bruises, and you immediately blamed a volunteer at her after-school program rather than considering other possibilities. Why? Because she was with him when I found her? Or because looking elsewhere would have meant examining your own household? Pierce pressed. Isn't it possible that Sophie was trying to tell Mr. Walsh the truth about where those bruises came from when you arrived and shut down that conversation? That's absurd. But Beatrice's hands were gripping the armrests of the witness chair, knuckles white. Pierce couldn't push further without evidence, but he'd planted doubt. When Beatrice stepped down, she looked less like a concerned mother and more like someone protecting a secret. The medical expert testified next, a doctor who'd examined Sophie 2 days after the incident. He described bruising consistent with finger pressure, approximately 3 to 4 days old. Pierce noted in cross-examination that the timeline meant the bruises predated Sophie's visit to the community center that day, but the doctor admitted he couldn't pinpoint the exact moment of injury. As the first day of testimony ended, Gideon felt exhausted. The truth was there, visible in the gaps of Beatrice's story, but truth was slippery in a courtroom. It had to be proven, demonstrated, made undeniable. And proving it required reaching Sophie, something that seemed impossible when her mother controlled every aspect of her life. That evening, Mrs. Russo made tea in Gideon's small kitchen while he sat numbly on his sofa. "That woman is scared," Mrs. Russo said firmly. "Did you see how she reacted when your lawyer asked about her husband? She's hiding something, but how do we prove it?" Gideon's voice was hollow. "Sophie's the only one who knows the truth, and her mother won't let her speak. Then we pray the truth finds another way out." Mrs. Russo pressed a warm mug into his hands. "Sometimes the truth doesn't need permission. It just needs time." The second week of trial brought a small victory that felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Pierce had finally obtained the full security footage from the community center, and it arrived on a USB drive that he clutched like a lifeline as they entered the courtroom Wednesday morning. "Your Honor, the defense would like to enter Exhibit 17, security camera footage from the Riverside Community Center, dated September 14th, Pierce announced. The bailiff set up a monitor where the jury could see clearly. The footage was silent but damning in its clarity. It showed Sophie entering the art room alone, standing uncertainly in the doorway. Gideon appeared, wiping paint from his hands, approaching her with obvious concern. Sophie pulled up her sleeve, showing her arm. Gideon leaned closer to look, not touching, just observing, and then Sophie's mouth moved, clearly speaking. The conversation lasted perhaps 30 seconds before Beatrice burst through the door with the force of a hurricane. Even without sound, her anger was visible. Sophie's face transformed from tentative trust to fear. Beatrice grabbed Sophie's wrist, yanked up the sleeve, and immediately turned on Gideon with clear accusation. Pierce paused the footage. "Ladies and gentlemen, you can see Mr. Walsh maintaining appropriate distance. You can see Sophie voluntarily showing him her injury. You can see her attempting to explain something before her mother's arrival. Cut that conversation short." Vaughan objected that the footage didn't capture what happened before or after. But the damage was done. The jury had seen it. Gideon's careful propriety, Sophie's willing approach, Beatrice's explosive intervention. Over the next 2 days, Pierce called his character witnesses. Mrs. Russo took the stand with the dignity of age and absolute conviction. "I've known Gideon Walsh for 3 years, she testified. "When my husband died, Gideon was the first person to knock on my door. He didn't bring casseroles or empty condolences. He fixed the leaking pipe under my sink that my husband had been meaning to repair. He shoveled my walkway every snowfall that winter without being asked. He carried my groceries when arthritis made the stairs difficult." Pierce guided her gently. "In your observation, how does Mr. Walsh interact with children?" "With respect and kindness. The Rodriguez children adore him. He carved wooden toys for them. I've watched him help the teenage boy downstairs with math homework, always in public spaces, always appropriate. He's not a man who seeks attention or praise. He just helps because that's who he is." Vaughan's cross-examination tried to suggest that predators often gain trust through helpful behavior, but Mrs. Russo shut him down with the authority of someone who'd lived through the Great Depression and 2 wars. "Young man, I've been on this earth 83 years. I've seen evil and I've seen good. That man," she pointed at Gideon, "is good. And that woman," her fingers swung toward Beatrice, "is lying to protect something she doesn't want exposed." The judge sustained Vaughan's objection to the last comment and instructed the jury to disregard it. But Mrs. Russo's conviction resonated in the courtroom. Mr. Delgado testified about Gideon's integrity in business dealings. Jennifer Kowalski, the single mother, described how Gideon had tutored her son without pay, turning around his failing grades. "My boy was struggling with math, getting frustrated and giving up," Jennifer testified, her voice thick with emotion. Gideon spent 6 months working with him twice a week at the library, always in public, always patient. He never asked for money. When I tried to pay him, he said helping kids learn was payment enough. My son is in high school now, taking advanced math. He credits Gideon with making him believe he could do it. The witnesses painted a picture of consistent character, a man whose kindness wasn't performance but pattern, woven through years of small actions and quiet service. Then Gideon took the stand. Pierce had prepared him. But nothing quite captured the vulnerability of sitting exposed before a courtroom full of strangers, judging your life. Gideon wore his only suit, his work-roughened hands folded in his lap, and spoke with simple honesty. "Tell the jury about yourself." "Mr. Walsh," Pierce began, "I'm a carpenter by trade, learned from my father. I've been doing finish work for 15 years, crown molding, built-ins, detailed trim work. After my wife passed 3 years ago, I needed something to fill the empty hours. A friend suggested volunteering at the community center, and I found purpose there. Why work with children?" Gideon's voice softened. "My wife and I wanted children but never had them. She used to say I had too much love stored up with nowhere to put it. After she died, helping kids, reading to them, helping with homework, just being present, it felt like honoring her memory, like putting that love somewhere it mattered." "Tell us about September 14th. Gideon described the afternoon in detail, the children's energy, Sophie's quiet arrival, her obvious distress. She stood in the doorway looking troubled. I asked if she wanted to paint with us, but she said she needed to talk. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes kids needed a listening ear. She showed me her arm, and I saw bruising that looked like finger marks. I was concerned. What did she say about it? She started to tell me about her stepfather being upset about work, but that's when Mrs. Langford arrived. Sophie tried to continue explaining, but her mother silenced her immediately and accused me. Pierce established the timeline, that the bruising appeared to be several days old, based on its color. That Gideon had only brief, supervised contact with Sophie. That his entire interaction was captured on camera. Then came Vaughan's cross-examination, and Gideon understood why the man commanded such high fees. "Mr. Walsh, you say you volunteered out of love for children. Isn't it true that you sought out environments where you'd have access to vulnerable young people?" "I volunteered at a licensed community center with background checks, supervision, and protocols." "You make it sound very proper. Yet somehow, Sophie Langford, a child in your care, ended up with bruises and was found alone with you. She wasn't in my care exclusively. There were other volunteers, other children present. And the bruises predated. You seem very familiar with the appearance and age of bruises on children, Mr. Walsh. Have you studied this?" Pierce objected to the implication, but Vaughan had planted the seed. He continued systematically trying to twist Gideon's kindness into calculation, his concern into manipulation, his presence at the community center into predatory behavior. "Your wife died 3 years ago. Isn't it true that you struggled with that loss? That you sought out young people to fill some emptiness in your life?" "I sought to help others, yes, by surrounding yourself with children, by inserting yourself into their lives, by making yourself indispensable to vulnerable families." Vaughan's voice was silk over steel. "Isn't it possible, Mr. Walsh, that your grief twisted into something darker? That your need for connection crossed boundaries you didn't even recognize?" "No." Gideon's voice was firm despite the tremor of emotion underneath. "I love my wife. I honored her by trying to be the kind of man she believed I was. Someone who helped others without expecting anything in return. And yet here we are, with a traumatized child and her mother's accusations. Sophie isn't traumatized by me. She's traumatized by being silenced when she tried to tell the truth." The judge called for order as murmurs rippled through the gallery. Vaughan smiled slightly. He'd gotten Gideon to show emotion, to make an accusation against Beatrice that couldn't be proven. When Gideon stepped down, he felt hollowed out. Pierce patted his shoulder reassuringly, but Gideon knew the damage Vaughan had done. Truth told plainly could sound defensive. Innocence explained could seem like practiced denial. That evening, the weight of it all crashed down on him. In his apartment, Gideon sat in darkness and wondered if justice was even possible when money and power controlled the narrative. He thought about Sophie, hoped she was safe, and prayed that somehow the truth she'd tried to tell would find its way into the light before it was too late. The trial had been in session for 2.5 weeks when everything changed. It was a Thursday evening, and Pierce had just finished reviewing his closing arguments in his cramped office when someone knocked hesitantly on the door. He opened it to find a woman in her late 40s. Her dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, her hands twisting nervously around the strap of her purse. Pierce recognized her from the courtroom gallery. She'd been present for several days of testimony, sitting in the back row with an expression of increasing distress. "Can I help you? My name is Paulina Cortez. I was Sophie Langford's nanny." Her accent carried the soft rhythm of someone who'd learned English as a second language but spoke it fluently. "I need to talk to you about what really happened." Pierce ushered her inside quickly, his heart rate accelerating. Witnesses appearing at the 11th hour were either gifts or disasters, and he couldn't yet tell which this would be. Paulina sat on the edge of the chair across from his desk, her posture rigid with fear and determination. "I've worked for Mrs. Langford for 8 years. I've taken care of Sophie since she was a baby. I've watched that little girl grow up in a house that looks perfect on the outside, but is cold as winter inside." "Tell me about the bruise," Pierce said gently. Paulina's eyes filled with tears. "It wasn't Mr. Walsh. It was never Mr. Walsh. Sophie got those bruises at home from her stepfather, Preston. He's not a bad man, not usually, but he drinks, and when he drinks, his temper comes out. He'd had a terrible day at work, was on his 3rd scotch, and he threw his phone in frustration. It hit Sophie's arm. She cried, but he didn't apologize. He never does." Pierce was already taking notes. "Did you witness this?" "No, but Sophie told me. She tells me everything. I'm the only person in that house who really listens to her." Paulina pulled a small notebook from her purse. "This is Sophie's journal. I found it in the trash after Mrs. Langford discovered it and threw it away. I kept it because I knew this was wrong, what they were doing to Mr. Walsh." Pierce opened the journal with careful hands. The pages were filled with a child's handwriting, looping letters, some words misspelled, but the meaning heartbreakingly clear. October 3rd. Preston was mad again today. He yells a lot when he drinks. Mommy pretends not to notice. September 12th. Preston grabbed my arm when I was too slow getting ready for school. It hurt, but I didn't cry because that makes him madder. September 15th. I tried to tell the nice man at the center about my arm, but Mommy came in and got so angry. Now she says I can't go back. I miss the other kids. I miss Mr. Gideon's stories." Pierce looked up at Paulina, his mind racing through the implications. "Why didn't you come forward sooner?" "Because I was afraid." Paulina's voice broke. "I needed this job. I send money home to my mother in Mexico. She depends on me. And Mrs. Langford, she's powerful. She has lawyers and connections. I'm just a nanny. Who would believe me over her? What changed your mind?" I couldn't sleep. Every night, I saw Mr. Walsh's face in that courtroom, a good man being destroyed because Mrs. Langford was too proud to admit what was happening in her own home. Paulina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "And Sophie, she's been so unhappy. She asked me yesterday why bad things happen to good people. She meant Mr. Walsh, but she could have been talking about herself." Pierce stood, pacing as he processed this information. "Mrs. Langford will say you're lying, that you fabricated the journal or coerced Sophie into writing it. The journal is in Sophie's handwriting. There are other entries dating back months, about school, about her friends, about things that have nothing to do with Preston or the trial. It's real." Paulina's voice steadied with conviction. "And I'm willing to testify. Mrs. Langford fired me this afternoon when she found out I'd been coming to the trial. I've nothing left to lose." "She fired you?" "She accused me of disloyalty, said I was conspiring with the defense." Paulina managed a bitter smile. "I wasn't, not until now. But watching that trial, seeing what she was doing, I couldn't stay silent anymore." Pierce called Gideon immediately. Within an hour, they were both in his office, reviewing the journal and Paulina's testimony. Gideon read Sophie's words with a mixture of sorrow and vindication. "That poor child," he said quietly, "living in that house, trying to tell someone, and being silenced. This changes everything," Pierce said, already drafting motions. "I'm filing for an emergency hearing tomorrow morning. This is newly discovered evidence that directly contradicts the prosecution's case." That night, while Pierce worked on legal documents, events were unfolding at the Langford mansion that none of them could have predicted. Beatrice confronted Paulina at the small carriage house behind the main residence where the nanny had lived for 8 years. "You went to his lawyer." Beatrice's voice was ice and fury. "After everything I've done for you, you betray me like this? You're destroying an innocent man." Paulina stood her ground, even as she packed her belongings. "Sophie tried to tell you the truth, and you silenced her. You coached her to stay quiet, threatened her with boarding school if she spoke. I protected my family's reputation." Preston made a mistake, one moment of frustration. It didn't mean he was abusive, but if social services got involved, if people started questioning, Beatrice's composure cracked. "Do you know what scandal does to people like us? The whispers, the judgment, the loss of standing? So you sacrificed Mr. Walsh instead." "He was convenient. Sophie mentioned talking to him, and I saw an opportunity to redirect the narrative." Beatrice's eyes were hard. "No one would miss a poor volunteer. But my husband's career, our social position, those matter." Preston arrived home then, his expensive car pulling up with the aggressive speed that suggested he'd already been drinking. He stumbled slightly getting out, his tie loosened and his face flushed. "What's all this?" he demanded, seeing the confrontation. "Your wife has been lying to protect you," Paulina said clearly. "She accused an innocent man of hurting Sophie because admitting you did it would damage your precious reputation." Preston's face darkened. "You threw me under the bus." He turned on Beatrice. "You let that man go to trial rather than deal with our problems privately?" "Our problems?" Beatrice's voice rose. "Your drinking, your temper, those are your problems, Preston. I just managed them." Their argument escalated, voices carrying through the evening air. Upstairs in the mansion, Sophie heard it all. She'd been listening through the heating vent in her room, a trick she'd learned long ago for understanding what the adults in her life wouldn't tell her directly. She heard Paulina defending Mr. Walsh. She heard her mother admitting to lies. She heard her stepfather's drunken rage, and she made a decision. Sophie found the letter she'd tried to write weeks ago, the one her mother had confiscated and destroyed. She'd rewritten it since then, hidden in her math textbook. It was addressed to the judge, explaining everything, how Preston had hurt her arm, how her mother had coached her to stay silent, how Mr. Walsh had only tried to help. She crept downstairs while her parents argued, slipped out the front door, and ran through the darkness toward Paulina's carriage house. The nanny, still packing, opened the door to find Sophie breathless and determined. "I want to tell the truth," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. "Can you help me tell the truth?" Paulina pulled the child into her arms, and together they called Pierce's emergency number. By midnight, Pierce, Gideon, Paulina, and Sophie were at the office, with a court-appointed child advocate arriving to ensure Sophie's rights were protected. The little girl sat in a chair that seemed too large for her, but her voice was steady as she explained what had really happened. Pierce recorded her statement, documenting everything while the advocate ensured no one pressured or coached her. "I want to tell the judge," Sophie said finally. "I want to tell everyone that Mr. Gideon didn't hurt me. He was nice to me when no one else was." Pierce filed his emergency motion at dawn, attaching Paulina's affidavit, Sophie's journal, and a request for Sophie to testify. The truth, silenced for so long, was finally demanding to be heard. The emergency hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock Friday morning. Judge Harold Brennan, a stern man in his 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes, reviewed Pierce's motion in his chambers while both legal teams waited in tense silence outside. Vaughan had arrived 30 minutes early, his usual composure fractured by the unexpected development. He paced the hallway like a caged animal, repeatedly checking his phone for instructions from Beatrice. When Pierce arrived with Gideon, Paulina and Sophie accompanied by her court-appointed advocate, Vaughan's expression darkened further. "Your Honor will see this as a transparent attempt to manipulate the proceedings," Vaughan said coldly to Pierce. "Coaching a child, fabricating evidence. The journal spans 6 months and contains entries completely unrelated to this case," Pierce interrupted. "And Sophie came forward of her own volition. Your client's nanny is willing to testify under oath about what really happened in that household." Vaughan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. The bailiff finally called them into chambers. Judge Brennan sat behind his massive desk, Sophie's journal open before him. He'd been reading for 20 minutes, his expression growing graver with each page. "Mr. Vaughan, I've reviewed this evidence. These are serious allegations that directly contradict your client's testimony." The judge's voice carried the weight of authority earned over decades on the bench. A child documenting fear of her stepfather's temper, bruises that predate the alleged incident, attempts to tell the truth that was silenced. "This is not something I can ignore, Your Honor. The defense has had weeks to produce this so-called evidence. Its sudden appearance reeks of desperation and manufacture." Vaughan's professional mask was firmly in place again. "I request time to authenticate the journal, to depose Ms. Cortez. To verify, the journal is written in a child's hand, contains dated entries with verifiable references to school events and activities." Judge Brennan closed the book with finality. "And Ms. Cortez has provided a sworn affidavit. More importantly, the child herself wishes to testify. A child who has been living with Ms. Cortez since last night, unsupervised by her legal guardian, potentially subject to coaching and influence. A child who fled a home where she felt unsafe and sought help from a trusted adult," Pierce countered. "Sophie's advocate has been present since the moment she arrived at my office. Every conversation has been documented and witnessed." Judge Brennan made his decision with the authority of someone who'd seen enough courtroom manipulation to recognize truth when it appeared. "The journal will be admitted as evidence. Miss Cortez will testify. And I'm ordering Sophie Langford to take the stand, with appropriate accommodations for her age. A child psychologist will be present, and I'll personally ensure she's not badgered or intimidated." Vaughan's objections were noted but overruled. Court would reconvene Monday morning at 9 o'clock. The judge's final words carried clear warning. "Mr. Vaughan, you might want to consult with your client about the wisdom of continuing this prosecution in light of these developments. Making false accusations in my courtroom is a serious matter." The weight of those words hung in the air as they filed out of chambers. Vaughan immediately pulled out his phone to call Beatrice, his voice low and urgent as he stepped away for privacy. Pierce gathered his team, Gideon, Paulina, Sophie, and the advocate, and led them to a quiet corner of the courthouse. "This changes everything," Pierce said, his voice carrying cautious optimism for the first time in weeks. "But we need to be prepared. Vaughan is wounded, but he's not defeated. He'll come at us hard on Monday." The weekend that followed felt suspended in time. Sophie stayed with Paulina at a hotel paid for by a victims' advocacy group, the two of them finding comfort in each other's presence. Child Protective Services opened an investigation into the Langford household, sending investigators to interview neighbors, teachers, anyone who'd had contact with the family. Preston, learning he was under scrutiny, checked himself into a treatment facility. Whether out of genuine remorse or calculated legal strategy, no one could say. Beatrice, for the first time in years, was alone with the consequences of her choices. Gideon spent Saturday with Mrs. Russo, who insisted he come to her apartment for a proper meal. She made him eat pot roast and potatoes, filled his plate twice despite his protests, and reminded him to have faith. "That little girl is braver than most adults I've known," the elderly woman said, watching him with the fierce, protective love of a surrogate mother. "She's going to set this right." "You'll see. I hope you're right." Gideon pushed food around his plate, his appetite dulled by nervous anticipation. "But even if she testifies, Vaughan will try to twist her words, make her doubt herself. That judge won't let him." I've been watching Judge Brennan throughout this trial. He's fair, but he's also got no patience for bullies. He'll protect that child. Mrs. Russo reached across the table and patted his hand. You've held on this long. Just hold on a little longer. Sunday, Pierce met with Sophie and the child psychologist, Dr. Sarah Chen, to prepare her for testimony. They met in a child-friendly room at the Advocacy Center. Soft chairs, warm colors, toys in the corner to help Sophie feel comfortable. Dr. Chen worked carefully to ensure Sophie understood the process without being coached on content. Tomorrow, you'll sit in a special chair in the courtroom and answer questions about what happened. Do you understand that? Sophie nodded. Will there be a lot of people? Yes, there will be. The judge, the lawyers, the jury, which is a group of people who will listen to everyone's story and decide what's true. Your mom will be there too. Sophie's face tightened with anxiety. Will she be angry with me? Dr. Chen chose her words carefully. She might be upset. But you're not responsible for managing your mother's feelings. You're only responsible for telling the truth about what happened to you. Can you do that? Mr. Gideon was nice to me. Sophie's voice was small but determined. I don't want him to go to jail for something he didn't do. That's not fair. No, it's not fair. So when they ask you questions tomorrow, you just tell them exactly what happened. Tell them about your arm, about how you got hurt, about Mr. Gideon. The truth is the most powerful thing you have. Okay. Sophie took a deep breath, as if preparing herself for battle. I can do that. They practiced with simple questions. What's your name? How old are you? Do you understand what it means to tell the truth? Sophie answered each one clearly, her confidence building with repetition. By the time they finished, Dr. Chen felt confident the child was as prepared as she could be. That evening, Gideon couldn't sleep. He lay on his sofa bed, staring at the ceiling, and thought about all the moments that had led to this point. Sophie showing him her bruise with such trust. Beatrice's explosive accusation that had shattered his world. The weeks of isolation and judgment, the character witnesses who'd risked their own reputations to vouch for him. Paulina's conscience finally overriding her fear. And now, a little girl preparing to speak truth in the face of her mother's fury. He thought about Anne, as he often did in difficult moments. She'd always believed that truth mattered, that integrity was worth any cost. Do the right thing even when it's hard, she used to say. Especially when it's hard. Sophie was doing that now, doing the right thing even though it terrified her. An 8-year-old child showing more courage than many adults ever found. Gideon said a prayer for her, that she'd find strength in the morning, that her voice would be heard and believed. Monday morning arrived with the weight of inevitability. The courtroom filled early. Word had spread about new developments, and the gallery was packed with spectators and media. Camera crews lined the courthouse steps. This case, once a simple accusation, had become something larger, a story about power and truth, wealth and justice. Gideon sat beside Pierce, his hands folded in his lap, and allowed himself the first real hope he'd felt in weeks. His worn suit had been pressed again, his shoes polished. Mrs. Russo sat directly behind him in the gallery, a solid presence of support. Beatrice arrived looking diminished somehow, her usual armor of expensive clothes and perfect makeup unable to hide the fear in her eyes. Dark circles suggested sleepless nights. Her shoulders, usually pulled back with confident posture, now curved slightly inward. She sat alone, Vaughan beside her professionally, but without warmth. Preston was notably absent, still in treatment, or perhaps wisely avoiding the courthouse entirely. Judge Brennan took the bench at precisely 9 o'clock and surveyed the courtroom with the gravity the moment deserved. The usual pre-session murmur died instantly under his gaze. We're here to consider newly discovered evidence in the case of People versus Walsh. Before we proceed with witness testimony, I want to make something clear. This court exists to pursue truth and justice, not to protect reputations or serve anyone's convenience. If anyone, his gaze swept the room, lingering meaningfully on Beatrice, has lied under oath, they will face consequences. Perjury is a crime, and I will not hesitate to refer such matters for prosecution. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the reporters stopped their note-taking to absorb the judge's warning. "Mr. Pierce, call your first witness." Pierce stood, straightening his tie with hands that trembled slightly with adrenaline and anticipation. "The defense calls Paulina Cortez." As the nanny rose and walked to the witness stand, Gideon felt the first real crack in the darkness that had surrounded him for weeks. Truth was finally getting its day in court, and he prayed, with everything he had left, that it would be enough. Paulina Cortez took the witness stand with visible nervousness, but when she placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice was steady. She'd spent 8 years caring for Sophie, and that love gave her courage now. The bailiff gestured for her to sit, and she smoothed her skirt with trembling hands before looking directly at Pierce. Pierce began gently, establishing rapport before moving to harder territory. "Miss Cortez, how long have you worked for the Langford family?" 8 years. I was hired when Sophie was just a baby, only 6 months old. And what are your responsibilities in the household? I'm Sophie's nanny. I prepare her meals, help with homework, take her to activities, put her to bed. I'm with her more than anyone else, more than her mother or stepfather. Describe your relationship with Sophie. Paulina's face softened with genuine affection. I'm more than her nanny. I'm the one who listens when she's had a bad day at school, who helps when she's struggling with math problems, who tucks her in at night and listens to her prayers. Mrs. Langford is busy with charity events and social obligations. Mr. Preston works long hours at his firm. Sophie and we talk about everything. She trusts me. Did she talk to you about the bruise on her arm? Paulina nodded, her voice strengthening with conviction. Yes, the day it happened, she came to me in the kitchen crying. She was holding her arm, and there were tears running down her face. She said Preston had thrown his phone in anger, and it hit her arm hard. She was scared and hurting. Vaughan was on his feet immediately. "Objection, Your Honor, hearsay." "It goes to the child's state of mind and the source of her injuries," Pierce argued calmly. "Ms. Cortez is establishing what Sophie told her immediately after the incident. A present-sense impression and statement of then-existing physical condition." Judge Brennan considered briefly. "I'll allow it." "The witness may continue." Pierce returned his attention to Paulina. "You said Preston had thrown his phone. Can you provide more context about that day?" "He'd been drinking. He drinks often after work. Scotch usually. That day he was on his 3rd or 4th glass, and he was on the phone with someone from his office. I could hear him from the kitchen getting louder and angrier. Then I heard him shout and the sound of something hitting, and Sophie cried out. What happened when you went to check on her?" Preston was standing there looking surprised, like he hadn't realized what he'd done. His phone was on the floor near Sophie. He told her to stop crying, that it was an accident. But he didn't apologize or ask if she was okay. He just picked up his phone and went to his study. Pierce let that image sit with the jury, a grown man more concerned with his phone than an injured child. "What did you do?" "I took Sophie upstairs, got ice for her arm, and held her while she cried. She asked me why Preston was always so angry. I didn't know what to tell her." "When did Mrs. Langford discover the bruise?" "The next evening, when she was helping Sophie get ready for bed. She saw the bruising and demanded to know what happened. Sophie tried to tell her it was Preston, but Mrs. Langford cut her off." Paulina's voice grew firmer, the memory clearly painful. She panicked. I could see it in her face. The fear of what people would think, what questions might be asked. "What specifically did Mrs. Langford say or do?" "She pulled me aside and told me this was a family matter that needed to stay private. She said Preston had been under stress at work, that one mistake didn't make him an abuser. Then she asked Sophie if she talked to anyone about her arm." Pierce's next question was careful, knowing its importance. "And what did Sophie say?" "Sophie mentioned that Mr. Walsh at the community center had noticed she looked sad and asked if she was okay. She said she'd shown him the bruise and was starting to tell him what happened when her mother arrived." Paulina's eyes met Gideon's across the courtroom. That's when Mrs. Langford saw an opportunity. "What do you mean by opportunity?" "She could blame Mr. Walsh instead of dealing with Preston's drinking problem. Sophie had been alone with him. At least that's how it could be made to look. The bruise was there. If she accused him quickly and loudly enough, no one would look too closely at what was happening in her own home. Vaughan objected again, arguing speculation, but Judge Brennan allowed Paulina to describe what she'd witnessed and heard directly. Pierce introduced Sophie's journal, handling it with appropriate reverence. "You brought Sophie's journal to my attention. How did you come to have it?" Mrs. Langford found it in Sophie's room about a week after the accusation. She was furious that Sophie had written about Preston's temper, about his drinking. I heard her shouting that Sophie was being disloyal, that family secrets stay in the family. She threw the journal in the kitchen trash. "What did you do?" "I waited until she left for a charity luncheon, and I retrieved it from the trash. I thought—" Paulina's voice caught with emotion. "I thought someone should know the truth about what happens in that house. That little girl was suffering, and her mother was more worried about reputation than Sophie's well-being." Pierce opened the journal to marked pages. "Can you verify this is Sophie's handwriting?" "Yes, absolutely. I've helped her with homework for 8 years. That's definitely her writing." Pierce read selected entries aloud, each one painting a picture of a child living with fear and tension. Preston's angry outbursts, her mother's cold dismissals, the loneliness of a girl surrounded by wealth but starved for genuine care. "Ms. Cortez, why didn't you come forward sooner?" Paulina's shoulders sagged with the weight of that question. "Because I was afraid. I'm an immigrant. I have a work visa that depends on my employment. I send money home to my mother in Mexico who depends on me. Mrs. Langford is wealthy and connected. I'm just a nanny. I thought—" She paused, gathering courage. "I thought no one would believe me over her. And I was afraid of losing everything." "What changed your mind?" "I couldn't sleep. Every night I saw Mr. Walsh's face in this courtroom, a good man being destroyed for something he didn't do. I watched the way he held himself with dignity, even when that expensive lawyer tried to make him look like a monster. And I thought about Sophie, forced to stay silent while an innocent person suffered." Paulina wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "My mother raised me to believe that doing nothing in the face of injustice makes you part of the injustice. I couldn't be part of this anymore." Pierce nodded, giving her a moment to compose herself. "Ms. Cortez, based on your 8 years of close observation, do you believe Gideon Walsh hurt Sophie?" "Absolutely not. Sophie talked about him sometimes. She said he was kind, that he listened when kids spoke, that he made everyone feel important. She looked forward to going to the community center because of volunteers like him." Paulina's voice was certain now. "Mr. Walsh didn't hurt Sophie. Preston did. And Mrs. Langford sacrificed an innocent man to protect her family's image. Vaughan's." Cross-examination was aggressive, but ultimately ineffective against Paulina's unshakable conviction. He suggested she'd fabricated her story out of spite after being fired, but she calmly pointed out she'd been attending the trial before her termination, something confirmed by courthouse security logs. He implied she'd coached Sophie on what to say, but Paulina detailed the timeline. Sophie had fled to her, not been summoned. The child advocate had been present for every conversation afterward. "Ms. Cortez, isn't it true you stand to benefit from this testimony? Perhaps a book deal, media appearances, financial compensation?" Paulina looked at him with the patient dignity of someone who'd found her moral center. "I stand to benefit from sleeping at night without guilt weighing on my conscience. That's all I want, sir. That and knowing I did the right thing, even when it cost me dearly." Vaughan had no effective response to that. When Paulina stepped down, she walked past Beatrice's table without looking at her former employer. The courtroom remained hushed, absorbing the power of her testimony. Judge Brennan addressed the court, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "Given the next witness's age and the sensitive nature of her testimony, I'm making accommodations. Dr. Chen will remain present throughout. I'll limit questioning time, and I will not tolerate any aggressive examination. The goal here is truth, not trauma. Is that understood by both counsel?" Both Pierce and Vaughan nodded their agreement. "Very well. Bailiff, please bring in the smaller chair." A child-sized chair was brought in and placed in the witness box, a visual reminder of Sophie's vulnerability that made several jury members shift uncomfortably in their seats. The symbolic power of that small chair, dwarfed by the formal courtroom surroundings, was not lost on anyone present. Judge Brennan looked at Pierce. "Call your next witness." The defense calls Sophie Langford. The courtroom doors opened with a whisper of hinges, and Sophie entered with Dr. Chen beside her. She wore a simple blue dress, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail secured with a blue ribbon. She looked impossibly small walking down the center aisle, her shoes making soft sounds against the floor, but her shoulders were straight and her chin was up. When she passed her mother's table, Beatrice reached out instinctively, her hand grasping at air, her face a mask of anguish and fear. But Sophie didn't stop, didn't turn, just kept walking forward toward the truth she'd been silenced from telling for too long. The bailiff helped Sophie into the child-sized chair, which had been positioned so she could see everyone in the courtroom without feeling towered over. Her feet dangled several inches from the ground, swinging slightly with nervous energy. Dr. Chen sat in a chair nearby, close enough to offer comfort if needed, but not so close as to appear to be coaching. Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly, his stern expression softening in a way that surprised those who knew him only as a strict jurist. His voice, usually commanding, became gentle. "Sophie, my name is Judge Brennan. Do you understand why you're here today?" "Yes, sir." Her voice was quiet but clear, carrying in the hushed courtroom. "I'm here to tell the truth about my arm and about Mr. Gideon." "Good. That's exactly right. Now I need you to answer the questions these lawyers ask you as honestly as you can. If you don't understand something, just say so. There's no shame in asking someone to explain. And if you need a break, at any time, or a glass of water, or just a moment to collect yourself, you tell me." "All right." Sophie nodded, then remembered proper courtroom procedure. "Yes, sir." The judge looked at Pierce. "Proceed, counselor. And remember my earlier warning." Pierce approached the witness stand slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. He'd questioned child witnesses before and understood the delicate balance required. Thorough enough to establish facts, gentle enough not to traumatize. "Sophie, thank you for being here today. I know this is scary. A little," she admitted. "But Dr. Chen said being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means doing the right thing even when you're scared." Several jury members nodded slightly, their faces softening at her candor. "That's very wise. Sophie, I'm going to ask you some questions, and I want you to just tell me what happened in your own words. Does that sound okay?" "Yes." "Do you remember the day you got the bruise on your arm, the one that caused all this trouble?" Sophie's small hands gripped the arms of her chair. "Yes, I remember it very well. Can you tell us what happened that day?" Sophie took a breath, and when she spoke, her voice was steady despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "Preston came home from work early. He was upset about something. I heard him on the phone yelling at someone. He went into the living room, where I was doing my homework at the coffee table." "What happened next?" "He was pacing around, holding his phone and talking loud. He kept saying bad words, words I'm not supposed to say. Then he shouted really loud and threw his phone across the room." Sophie's voice wavered. "It hit my arm really, really hard. It hurt so much I started crying." Pierce kept his voice gentle. "What did Preston do when you started crying?" He looked at me like he'd forgotten I was there. His face was surprised for a second. Then he got this angry look and told me to stop crying, that it was just an accident and I was being dramatic. Sophie's lower lip trembled. But he didn't say sorry. He just picked up his phone to see if it was broken and walked away. "Did you tell anyone what happened?" "I ran to find Paulina. She's my nanny, but she's more like—" Sophie searched for the right words, "like the person who actually cares about me. She got ice for my arm and let me cry and told me it would be okay." "When did your mother see the bruise?" "The next day at bedtime. She was helping me put on my pajamas and saw my arm. It was all purple and yellow by then. She asked what happened, and I tried to tell her Preston threw his phone, and it hit me. Pierce noticed Sophie's hands gripping the chair arms tighter. "What did your mother say?" "She got really quiet, which is scarier than when she's loud. She asked me if I'd told anyone, and I said no except Paulina. Then she said," Sophie's voice dropped to almost a whisper, "she said this was a family matter, and I shouldn't talk about family matters with strangers. She said people wouldn't understand, that they might take me away from her." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the court reporter's fingers had stilled on the keys. "Did that frighten you? The idea of being taken away?" "Yes." A tear rolled down Sophie's cheek. "I don't want to live with strangers, but I also don't like being scared in my own house." Dr. Chen reached over and offered Sophie a tissue, which she took gratefully. Judge Brennan asked if she needed a break, but Sophie shook her head. "I want to finish," she said with quiet determination. Pierce continued carefully. "Sophie, what happened at the community center a few days later?" Sophie's expression shifted slightly, the fear mixing with something warmer, fondness. "I was feeling sad that day. My arm still hurt, and Preston had been drinking again the night before and yelling at Mommy. At the community center, Mr. Gideon noticed I looked upset. He always notices when kids are sad. What did Mr. Gideon do? He asked if I wanted to paint with the other kids, but I didn't feel like it. So I asked if I could talk to him." Sophie looked directly at Gideon now, her young face earnest. "He's always kind like that. He listens to us. Really listens, not like grown-ups who just pretend." "What did you tell him?" "I showed him my bruise because it still looked bad. He looked worried, not scary worried, but like he cared. He asked how I got it, and I started to tell him about Preston being angry and throwing his phone." Sophie's voice grew stronger with the truth. "I wanted to tell him because I thought maybe he could help. But then Mommy came in early." "What happened when your mother arrived?" Sophie's face clouded again. "She saw my sleeve was up and my bruise showing. She got this look on her face, like she was scared and angry at the same time. She grabbed my wrist and pulled up my sleeve all the way to look at the bruise. Then she turned to Mr. Gideon and started yelling." "What did she say?" "She said, 'What did you do to my daughter?' She said it like Mr. Gideon had hurt me, but he hadn't. He was just looking at my arm, because I showed it to him." Sophie was crying openly now, but she kept talking. "I tried to tell her it was Preston, that Mr. Gideon was just trying to help, but she told me to be quiet. She told me to stop talking. Why do you think your mother blamed Mr. Gideon?" Vaughn half rose to object, but Judge Brennan held up a hand. "I'll allow the question. The child may answer based on her understanding." Sophie thought carefully before responding. "Because it was easier than being mad at Preston. And because if people knew Preston hurt me, even by accident, they would ask questions. Mommy cares a lot about what people think. She didn't want people to think our family has problems." Pierce felt the weight of that simple, devastating truth. "Sophie, I need to ask you directly. Did Gideon Walsh ever hurt you?" "No." Sophie's voice rang clear and certain through the courtroom. "Never, not even a little bit. He was always nice to me and all the kids. He read us stories about adventures and helped us with math when it was hard and made everyone feel special. When kids were sad, he listened to them. When they were happy, he smiled with them, like their happiness made him happy too. Did he ever ask you to keep secrets from your mother?" "No. He told me once that if something was wrong at home, I should always tell a trusted grown-up. He said it's never okay for kids to feel scared in their own houses." Sophie wiped her eyes. "I wish I'd been brave enough to tell someone the truth sooner. Then Mr. Gideon wouldn't have gotten in trouble for being nice." Pierce's throat tightened with emotion, but he maintained his professional composure. "You're being very brave right now, Sophie. Thank you for telling the truth. No further questions, Your Honor." Judge Brennan looked at Vaughn with an expression that clearly conveyed the precarious position the prosecutor now occupied. "Cross-examination, Mr. Vaughn." Vaughn stood slowly, and Gideon could see the calculation in his eyes. The man knew the case was lost, but professional pride demanded he at least go through the motions. He approached the witness stand with visible caution, aware that any aggressive questioning would only make things worse. "Sophie, I only have a few questions. When Mr. Walsh saw your bruise, did he touch you at all?" "No, he just looked at it." He kept his hands to himself like the center rules say volunteers are supposed to. Did he ever ask you to lie about anything? No, he doesn't lie. He's one of the good grown-ups. Vaughn had no effective line of questioning that wouldn't further establish Gideon's innocence or Sophie's credibility. No further questions. As Sophie stepped down from the witness stand, she didn't return to the gallery. Instead, she walked directly to where Gideon sat at the defense table. Pierce started to intervene, worried about propriety, but Judge Brennan made no move to stop her. Sophie stood in front of Gideon, her small face tilted up to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry I didn't tell the truth sooner," she whispered, though in the silent courtroom everyone heard. "I was scared of what would happen. But Paulina said you were suffering because of me, and that wasn't fair." Gideon's eyes were wet, his voice thick with emotion. "You were protecting yourself, Sophie. That's nothing to apologize for. You were brave today, so brave. That's what matters now." Sophie suddenly wrapped her arms around him in a brief hug, then hurried back to sit with Dr. Chen, leaving Gideon to wipe his eyes while the jury watched with expressions ranging from moved to outright tearful. Judge Brennan allowed a moment for everyone to collect themselves before speaking. "We'll take a brief recess. Mr. Vaughn, Mr. Pierce, I'll see you both in my chambers in 10 minutes. During the recess, Vaughn and Beatrice conferred in urgent whispers. Her face had gone from pale to grey, and she seemed to have aged years in the past hour. When Judge Brennan reconvened court, the atmosphere had shifted completely. "Does the prosecution wish to present any rebuttal evidence?" the judge asked. Vaughn stood, his usual confidence replaced by grim professionalism. "Your Honor, in light of the testimony heard today, and after consultation with my client, the prosecution requests permission to withdraw all charges against Gideon Walsh." The words seemed to echo in the sudden stillness of the courtroom. Pierce was on his feet immediately. "Your Honor, the defense requests the court issue a directed verdict of not guilty, thereby clearing Mr. Walsh's record completely and preventing any possibility of these charges being refiled." Judge Brennan's gavel came down with resounding finality. "Motion granted. The court finds Gideon Walsh not guilty on all charges. Mr. Walsh, you're free to go with the court's sincere apologies for what you've endured." The courtroom erupted in applause, despite the bailiff's calls for order. Mrs. Russo was openly weeping with joy. Pierce shook Gideon's hand firmly, then pulled him into an unprofessional but entirely human embrace. Judge Brennan waited for silence before continuing, his voice carrying stern authority. "Mrs. Langford, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of perjury and filing a false police report. You may wish to consult with counsel about those charges." Court is adjourned. As the gavel fell one final time, Gideon closed his eyes and breathed in the sweet, almost painful relief of vindication. Outside the courthouse, autumn sunlight felt different somehow, warmer, more forgiving, as if the world itself had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Gideon stood on the steps with Mrs. Russo beside him, Pierce on his other side, and breathed in air that no longer tasted of fear and uncertainty. Reporters clustered around them, a forest of microphones and cameras, but Pierce had warned him this moment would come. Gideon had prepared a statement, though now, standing in the moment of freedom, the words felt almost inadequate. "I'm grateful for the truth coming to light," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'm grateful for Sophie's courage. An 8-year-old child showed more bravery than most adults ever have to find. I'm grateful for Paulina Cortez, who risked everything to do what was right. And I'm grateful for everyone who stood by me when it would have been easier to turn away." He glanced at Mrs. Russo, who squeezed his arm with fierce affection. "Justice took its time, but it arrived. That's what matters. And I hope," his voice caught slightly, "I hope Sophie gets the help and safety she deserves now." The reporters shouted follow-up questions, but Pierce guided Gideon away, down the steps and into the crisp November air. Mrs. Russo insisted on taking them both to lunch at a small diner she loved, and for the first time in months, Gideon ate without the weight of dread sitting heavy in his stomach. The construction company called that afternoon while Gideon was back in his apartment, still processing the morning's events. Pete Sutherland's voice came through the phone, warm with relief and apology in equal measure. "Gideon, corporate wants you back immediately. They're embarrassed about how they handled this, putting you on leave without waiting for facts. They're offering full back pay for every week you were out, and they're giving you a raise. I told them you're the best Finnish carpenter I've got, and I meant it. When can you start?" "Monday morning," Gideon said, a smile breaking across his face for what felt like the first time in forever. "I'll be there Monday morning." The community center reached out next. Patricia Warren's voice trembled with emotion as she spoke. "Gideon, the board met this morning after the news broke. They want you back as soon as you're ready. The kids have been asking about you constantly. They never stopped asking. We're planning a welcome back celebration if you're willing. Nothing big, just the families who know you and love you." "I'd like that," Gideon said quietly. "I'd like that very much." 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when the autumn leaves had turned gold and crimson, Gideon returned to the Riverside Community Center. He'd been nervous on the walk over, wondering if the place would feel different now, tainted by association with his ordeal. But when he pushed open the familiar doors, all his worries vanished. Children erupted from every corner, a joyful chaos of small bodies and excited voices. They swarmed him like he was a returning hero, hugging his legs, tugging his hands, demanding to know where he'd been and why he'd been gone so long, and did he bring any new stories to read them. All right, give the man some breathing room," Patricia called out, laughing through happy tears. The art room had been decorated with a banner reading, "Welcome back, Mr. Gideon," in crayon letters clearly created by many small hands. Tables were laden with food, brought by families, dishes representing the neighborhood's beautiful diversity. Mrs. Russo had brought her famous lasagna. Mr. Delgado contributed tamales from his mother's recipe. The Rodriguez family brought a cake decorated with a wooden toy design in frosting. Throughout the afternoon, parents approached Gideon to shake his hand, to apologize for doubting him, to express gratitude that justice had prevailed. Some had tears in their eyes as they spoke. Others simply gripped his hand tightly, their expressions conveying what words couldn't quite capture. Mr. Delgado presented Gideon with a wooden plaque he'd commissioned from a local craftsman. It read "Community Hero" in hand-carved letters with smaller text below, "For integrity, kindness, and truth." "I'm no hero," Gideon protested, his voice rough with emotion. "I just told the truth and held on to what I knew was right." "Sometimes that's the hardest thing to be," Mr. Delgado replied, echoing words Mrs. Russo had spoken months ago. "Standing firm in truth when the world is trying to bend you into a lie. That takes a kind of strength most people never have to find." The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm that felt both familiar and transformed. Gideon returned to his construction work, his hands finding their old certainty with crown molding and detailed trim. His co-workers welcomed him back with backslaps and genuine warmth. And the foreman made sure everyone knew the company had been wrong to doubt him. At the community center, the children gravitated to him as they always had, perhaps even more so now. Word had spread about what happened, filtered through parent conversations and news reports, and the kids treated him with a mixture of their usual affection and a new respect, as if they understood in their intuitive way that he'd been through something hard and come out the other side still himself. The legal aftermath continued to unfold with the slow machinery of justice. Beatrice Langford faced charges for filing a false police report and perjury. Her high-powered attorneys negotiated a plea deal, 2 years probation, 500 hours of community service, mandatory counseling, and a substantial fine. Her social standing, once so carefully protected, crumbled under the weight of public judgment. The charity boards she'd served on quietly asked for her resignation. The country club membership she'd prized was voluntarily surrendered. The life she'd built on appearances dissolved when the truth underneath was finally exposed. Preston completed a 60-day inpatient treatment program, and continued with outpatient therapy and anger management classes. He and Beatrice separated, not divorced yet, but living apart while they each worked on the issues that had poisoned their home. Preston's employer put him on a leave of absence that everyone understood might become permanent, depending on how things developed. Sophie went to live with Beatrice's sister, a woman named Catherine, who taught elementary school and had a warmth her sister had never cultivated. The aunt's modest house in a tree-lined suburb was worlds away from the Langford mansion in terms of square footage, but it held something the mansion never had: genuine love and safety. Child Protective Services monitored the situation closely. Weekly supervised visits with Beatrice were slowly, carefully rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured by lies and misplaced priorities. It would take time, perhaps years, for Sophie to fully trust her mother again. But Catherine's patient guidance and Beatrice's court-mandated therapy were steps in the right direction. Paulina found a new position with a family who valued her integrity and courage. But she remained actively involved in Sophie's life, visiting regularly with Catherine's blessing. The bond between nanny and child had proven stronger than employment contracts or legal complications. It was built on years of genuine care and mutual trust. One cold Saturday in early December, as the first snow of winter began to fall, Gideon was at his workbench in his apartment, sanding a piece of wood, when someone knocked. He opened the door to find Sophie and Paulina standing in the hallway, both bundled in winter coats. Sophie held a carefully wrapped package. "Mr. Gideon, I made you something," Sophie said, her voice carrying none of the fear it had held months ago. She seemed lighter somehow, as if a weight had been lifted. Gideon invited them in, offered hot chocolate, which Sophie accepted eagerly, and carefully unwrapped the package. Inside was a drawing on construction paper, crayon and marker, showing a man surrounded by children in what was clearly the community center. The sun shone bright yellow in the corner. Everyone in the picture was smiling. At the top, in careful letters that showed how much concentration she'd put into each word: "Thank you for being kind when nobody else was." Gideon felt his throat tighten with emotion. "This is beautiful, Sophie." "Thank you. Aunt Catherine says people who are kind when it's hard are the best kind of people," Sophie said seriously. "She says you're a hero." "I'm not a hero, sweetheart. I'm just a man who tries to do right. That's what heroes are," Sophie replied, with the simple wisdom of childhood. They talked for a while, Sophie sharing enthusiastically about her new school, her aunt's 2 cats, the friends she was making in the neighborhood. Paulina added details, her face reflecting the relief of seeing her beloved charge finally thriving in a safe environment. Before they left, Gideon presented Sophie with something he'd been working on for weeks: a carved wooden horse, painted with care and sanded smooth as silk. The mane flowed in an imagined wind, and the legs were positioned mid-gallop, as if frozen in a moment of joyful freedom. "I made this for someone special months ago," Gideon explained, placing it gently in Sophie's hands. "I think that someone should be you." Sophie cradled the horse like it was made of glass, her eyes wide with wonder. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." "Keep it somewhere you can see it," Gideon said softly. "And remember that telling the truth, even when it's scary, even when people you love might be angry, that's always the right choice. Truth will set you free." Sophie hugged him then, a tight squeeze that conveyed gratitude and affection and the beginning of healing. When she and Paulina left, Gideon watched them walk down the hallway, Sophie clutching the wooden horse, Paulina's arm around her shoulders, and felt a profound sense of peace. That evening, Mrs. Rousseau came by with soup and her usual mixture of practicality and wisdom. They ate together in comfortable silence, the kind that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. Finally she spoke. "Anne would be so proud of you, you know. The way you held onto your goodness through all of it, never got bitter, never lost faith in people even when people lost faith in you." Gideon thought about his late wife, as he often did in quiet moments. How she'd believed in truth, in kindness, in the fundamental importance of showing up for others, even when it cost you something. He'd honored her memory not just by surviving the trial, but by emerging from it unchanged, in the ways that mattered most. "I hope so," he said quietly. "I tried to be the man she believed I was." "You succeeded," Mrs. Russo said firmly, "and you gave that little girl her voice back. That's worth more than you know." Outside, snow continued to fall, soft, silent, covering the city in white. Inside Gideon's modest apartment, warmth radiated from friendship and the quiet satisfaction of a life lived with integrity. Across town, Sophie's wooden horse sat on her windowsill in Aunt Catherine's house, catching the light from the street lamp, a symbol of hope and new beginnings. The wooden horse would remain there through the years to come, a reminder of the day a child found her courage and a good man found his vindication. Sophie would take it with her when she eventually went to college, would keep it on her desk through graduate school, would place it on the shelf in her first apartment, and later in the home she'd make with her own family. And whenever life required difficult truths to be spoken, whenever courage seemed in short supply, she'd look at that carved horse frozen in mid-gallop and remember Mr. Gideon, the kind man who noticed when children were sad, who listened when they spoke, who stood firm in truth even when the world tried to paint him as a monster. Truth, as Mrs. Russo had promised all those months ago, had finally found its way into the light. And Gideon Walsh, carpenter, volunteer, good man, was at peace with himself and the world. He was finally completely free.